Today's show is especially cool because if you're into simulation theory, you think about the simulation, super winks from the simulation today on this show. Like the simulation is just winking at us nonstop on the show today. So let's get started. First of all, you know what I noticed when I looked at the map? I love maps. I look at it and I go on Google Earth and all these things all the time. When I noticed this show is called The Breakup. We look at relationships and show in money and compare them for Bitcoin and dollars. When I'm looking at the two recent super spreader events on the globe, this shows about relationships, breakups. I look at Canada, and then I look with all the truckers, and then everything that's going on in Russia with the debanking. And I'm saying, in terms of the breakup, it looks like the top is like off. Like if we're talking about new relationships, like the top is down on the world. You know, the top of the world is like becoming Bitcoiners, or at least super spreader events. And it looks like Russia is going to be the greatest super spreader event that we've ever seen. We've mentioned this guy named Camille Galli a few times on this show, and Camille has these incredible Twitter threads constantly. He's analyzed everything. He's from the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center. I don't know much about him before, so I haven't gone in a deep dive in his experience, but boy, is he ever coherent on Russia and Ukraine, and a lot of amazing insight that sort of checks out with me with what little bit I know, but at least it makes sense. He had an amazing thread yesterday called Crisis and Jubilee. And I'll read a bit of it. It was really long. It's almost an essay. And he's recently on his Twitter, if you want to go check it out, has created a series of threads, link backs to these threads. So you can see all kinds of these Twitter threads he's been on lately. So let's start. Russia's spiraling into a deep crisis. It was visible before the war, but now it's rapidly accelerating. And every major crisis entails mass redistribution of power, property, and status, because crisis is essentially a jubilee. And he starts explaining what jubilees were. In ancient Israel, every 49th year, there was a huge managed default on debts forgiven, any liens on land, anyone in personal servitude, everything would be forgiven. It would be a huge party, and it would be the start of all kinds of new stuff. So it was this huge annulling of obligations. And when we look, Camille says, at what's going on in Russia today, for example, with the ATMs, with the huge lineups at ATMs, and what he writes is all of this is basically, he writes really coherent. This is not a Bitcoiner writing coherently about what's going on with that. He goes, this is all borrowed. We see fiat in all its cruelty. Previously, you could delude yourself that your bank deposits were your own. Nope. It's what you borrowed to the bank. It's what you borrowed to the bank, he says. This loan can be defaulted on. And inflation being another huge jubilee moment in history, that when hyperinflation does happen, you get another one of these jubilee moments. And you see other instances of it. You see all these assets getting frozen around the world, the yachts from Abramovich in Europe and all these other guys. And you see that one of the amazing things with all of this is that he describes it as very unique in Russia because it's caught between a history that they have between the courtiers, like court courtiers, so people who would introduce you around and show you the way and open doors, and barons. And here's his sort of TLDR. Much of current Russia political dynamics is understandable in the context of conflict between the courtiers and the barons. In the normal times, courtiers will centralize all the power and all the cash flows in their hands. The barons from the really hyper natural resources area, for example, are sort of a threat and must be weakened by the central government in Russia. In peacetime, Russian geography, economy, institutions favor the courtiers over the barons. It's so large, centralized power helps keep control of the sparsely populated situation. Putin's political theory, is simply the courtiers winning. However, the Jubilee entails a major redistribution of power, property, and status. Anyone with control over resources may try to default. And he goes on and shows in the 1990s how common this was. That was one of those periods where the barons beat the courtiers in Russian society. And a lot of Putinism was about getting that out of the system. Everything that had grown with this decentralization, decentralized power in provinces became his mission to eradicate. And in fact, even on a level of political federalism, because Russia is supposed to be a federation like America or Canada, and in fact is not anymore at all. any governor from any state, any bureaucrat from any state is now a federal employee. That just happened last year. The truckers there also, they had trucker problems just like Canada. So these two places that are around the world turning to Bitcoin. We had the trucker situation in Canada and Russia too. The truckers were people they couldn't control, that had all kinds of ways of getting through the system, a bit maybe like the original Freemasons in medieval time who were building temples and shrines and weren't stuck to a castle. These guys could move around Russia and see information. Well, what they ended up doing was they put in a system that stops them. It counts them every mile and taxes them from the federal government. They put this all around the country. I'm trying to find what it was called again. I found the name for it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What Camille is now predicting is that you're going to see widespread sabotage, because that's what happens in those instances of barons taking control and a jubilee, everyone defaulting, no deals really getting done. And there's no realistic way Putin will be able to keep such a huge apparatus as he's developed over the years on expensive oil running. He bred them, but he won't be able to feed them anymore, is what he's saying. And so all of these people, because of their position or whatever, would sort of turn against the system and it would start breaking apart. And that brings us to our lesson today and the first big simulation wing. So when I read this, I said, well, that's a lot like the Ides of March. And the Ides of March are exactly the same. They were a time of debt forgiveness in Roman contracts. This is the Roman New Year, and it's today. So I looked it up today, and it's today. So the Ides of March is the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated. Beware the Ides of March. In ancient Rome, it was the day where all debts would be accounted for. Huge parties began after this, because this is the Roman New Year right now. That's why in the Roman calendar, September, October, November, December, the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th month. It had nothing to do with what it is now, the 9th, 10th, 11th, they were two off. We made our New Year's because of the Christian change the same time as Christmas, but in Roman times, New Year's is now. And the Ides of March are the beginning of that season. They begin the whole new year. And this is when yearly contracts, this is when you're, the year in review, year one in review, we're from Rome. That's when you would do it right now. And one of the most amazing things when I think of it is, we go from Russia, which in its own mind is the modern Rome. That's why the Tsar is really the Caesar. And if you go through history, it went Rome, and then the capital moved to Byzantium. To this day, we think of Byzantine as too complicated and too bureaucratic, and you got to apply, and it's all really, hard. What ended up happening was the people in Kiev, the Rus people, sort of Swedish, really, came down and were the ones who helped stabilize the Orthodox Church, which had grown out of Byzantium, which was falling to the Turks and became eventually Constantinople. But that's where the Orthodox Church came in. So Kiev was really the foundation of the Russian people and the Russian Empire. And you've heard a lot of people analyze that and all that stuff. So Russia, Byzantine, Rome. But the arc that we follow here is really this one on cryptography. And we've talked about it on this show before. The Byzantine general's problem is a huge piece of cryptography, a huge mental exercise in cryptography. And you hear it a lot in these proof of stake coins. They always go on about Byzantine generals' problems. We're not selling coins here. This is not a distributed mechanism for consensus that we're talking about. But we are going to talk about something that is very familiar to most people in the crypto industry anyway, the Byzantine generals' problem. So from Byzantium to the Byzantine generals' problem. Our frame for Bitcoin for a long time has been, let's say, the trickle down of cryptography, a thing that was only used in state warfare, and for years was only used in state warfare. And this is a perfect example. The Byzantine generals' problem is when you have some generals who aren't on your side, but you need a coordinated attack on the target. And the attack will only work if coordinated. It must be a coordinated attack. If it's not coordinated, you can't bother. So they have to make sure that everyone who acts is on their side. The limiting factors are you're not allowed to use a communication system. You're not allowed to use smoke signals. You're not allowed to use fire. You've got to just know from a series of messages that you send that you're going to be able to do this. So the Byzantine general's problem allows a general to, with confidence, know that even though he's got traitors in his midst, he can launch a centralized attack on a sieged city. Here, our siege city, in my view, is actually our brains. And what I'm arguing is that when cryptography all those years ago began, Rome, all those years, Byzantium time, and now finally to the Russian time, we see what happens when cryptography is only on one side of the equation. But with Bitcoin and with all these other things, we're seeing that we can actually now start planning attacks that are not coordinated. One of the crazy things about what's going on with the Byzantine, this problem, especially with the way the Russians are concerned, everybody has to be in on it for it to work. For the Russian attack here, for this thing to work, not one party, if, for example, Alexander Ovechkin, a very famous hockey player, were to say, pay me in Bitcoin, right? He would suddenly be removed from Putin's team, if you will. Ovechkin's mother was an Olympic athlete, heavily courted by the Putin administration. Ovechkin himself has been heavily courted by the Putin administration. But it's very difficult for someone like Alexander Ovechkin to make a political protest. His mother, for God's sakes, is a hostage, for lack of a better word. So one of the cool things that we can actually start imagining is Bitcoin provides you with this opportunity to actually be outside of the coordination of a lot of these institutions because you're in a different form of money now. So, you know, as Bitcoiners, we should be focusing on, in particular, Russian refugees at this point, because the Russian situation has created more potential Bitcoiners than I think anything. All these credit card companies that have been virtue signaling, we don't like Russia and all that stuff, they actually just cut off the credit cards to the refugees who left Russia, maybe in protest for what was going on. It wasn't the credit cards in Russia that ended up getting clipped. It was the people who left and fled. So you have all of these refugees right now really looking probably to pay for their Airbnbs and their hotels and all that stuff. So a lot like what happened with Canada, with its truckers, we have all of a sudden seen a super spreader event. And I saw Kraken and Jesse Powell say they were going to give $1,000 to every Ukrainian resident user of the platform. You know, tremendous idea, and I think totally appropriate. But I think we need to start focusing on Russians as well, who are refugees, who really could use Bitcoin right now, probably want nothing to do with Putin. And they help us in this world where we don't need a coordinated attack. The thing that Bitcoiners can do is an uncoordinated attack. And I'll show you a little bit about what it looks like, because if we're thinking of jubilees, we're thinking of changing orders, we're thinking of, you know, the different parties that want to get into it. We mentioned Ovechkin. If it's not medicine, if it's not the news, if it's not athletes and the banks and the courts and religion that are all doing it at the same time, there are cracks. The thing about Bitcoin is, if you look at this case, we could take Ovechkin, but let's look in Brooklyn yesterday. You have Kyrie Irving, an American basketball player who was banned by one rule that said he's not allowed to play in the game. So what does Kyrie Irving do? He bought court seat tickets, which was according to the rules, because the fans could sit without a mask. So here's a guy who is completely making fun of the system as it is. And in the press conference after, his teammate, Kevin Durant, who some people say is the greatest basketball player other than LeBron James, Kevin Durant said, and I think it was a huge moment, he actually criticized New York's mayor. And if you want to know what a lot of people would like to see, it's a healthy political debate that isn't just based on skin color, but is based on ideas. And a lot of people, what they saw there was Kevin Durant. You know, a lot of people are celebrating New York City has an African-American mayor. The Brooklyn Nets are a big team. Kevin Durant is a big hero in the Brooklyn community. But here he is criticizing the mayor and really shaking up the political box. This is another one of those instances where not everyone's on the same page, because these are normal things that people would disagree about. If you look at some of the, let's call it, persuasion that a fellow like Elon Musk is using right now, right? When Elon Musk is out there challenging a duel, challenging Putin to a duel, he gets so much attention for what he's doing. And it really forces you to see the world in a whole new way. When you're saying, I'm going to challenge you in a duel, what does that force you to do? Right away, you say, well, what does that look like compared to what we're already doing? It actually looks better, right? The idea of these two guys fighting, your brain forces you to see it that way. You take Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister, he said the same thing today, right? One guy, he doesn't need a bunch of institutions, although I think he probably has some help on what he's doing. But he goes today with this, you know, way over the top thing, which I think is effective, where he tells the Russian soldiers in his country that if they surrender, they're going to get treated better in Ukraine than they would have been treated in Russia. So he's not arguing we might win the war, we could win the war, who knows, it looks better than we were. No. He's already forcing you to go way ahead and say, we've already won the war, now we're going to treat you better. We're going to treat you better than you were treated by the people who sent you here. This is something where you're basically, you don't need the coordination. You're putting the thoughts in the person's head and forcing them to see what will happen afterwards. And you can do that with just one person. It doesn't require the extreme coordination of every institution in the world. So when I think of this trickle down of cryptography and all the things it solves, we see it was in Roman times, and then it went to the Byzantine generals. But in the end, the Byzantine generals' problem, this coordinated attack, is kind of their problem. That's kind of like the fiat world's problem, right? They've got to keep the oil and gas people happy. They got to keep the cartels on their side with their money as the reserve. They've got to do all that. If you're coming from the Bitcoin world, all you need is one Kyrie Irving for now. All you need is doing what he did, doing that super high level of persuasion. It doesn't require coordination from the medical industry. The medical industry will have a debate about what Kyrie Irving did. It's much more persuasive than someone just making an argument. He's out there showing the world it's full of clowns, it's full of morons and stupid people. And when you actually, think about it, it's about fault tolerance. So when we think of the Byzantine generals' problem, it's about fault tolerance. How many mistakes can a system hold and not break? What I'm saying is the fiat world has a lot of Byzantine fault intolerance. It requires a heavily coordinated media, a heavily coordinated regulatory infrastructure, a heavily coordinated Hollywood infrastructure, a heavily coordinated athletic infrastructure. And when these pieces start falling apart, everything changes really quick. And we get to the Ides of March, we get to the Jubilee time, we get to total and complete change when people like Kyrie Irving can sort of go on about stuff. Now, the simulation is winking, Kyrie Irving is known for flat Earth stuff, right? So I'm obviously not defending flat Earth. But I will tell you a little interesting note about flat Earth. Do you know what flat Earth might have been? The Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, we were actually, and this is the wink part, I was talking about it with Q, our colleague on the show, who you'll hear from in a second yesterday, about the Washington Redskins and the whole, what is a Redskin? And I said, actually, doesn't really just mean a pejorative name for First Nations people. It can also mean the ritualistic painting of skin of the priestly class of the Phoenician Empire, who were the ones that Rome beat in order to become the Roman Empire. They had to beat the Carthaginians. They had a bunch of names, but basically Tunisia, right? Carthage, Tunis, Tatooine, if you're into Star Wars, that little country on the south. That place there was Carthaginian, and the Romans beat it. And it could be that flat Earth was basically just propaganda, because it looks like the Phoenicians knew the world was round and sailed to all kinds of places in the world. It's sort of unproven, but there's this idea that there isn't enough iron in Europe to actually have the Iron Age. And where was it? Where was all the copper mined? Some people think it was mined many thousands of years ago in Michigan, because there are signs of copper being pulled out and no copper found amongst the Amerindian people. And that's what makes the story of Jekyll Island so amazing. There's also no history of child sacrifice in all of North American, Native American culture. It's not a thing they did. They loved their kids. There was wars and all kinds of craziness, but it was not like the hunter-gatherer families dealing with children in that way. And when they found Jekyll Island, if you read the book Creature from Jekyll Island, it was actually an astonishing thing that there were people with the red. They put the red on their skin, right? Right near Washington, D.C., they put the red on their skin. And there are some people who think it came from the Vikings, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and all that stuff. Now, I don't know anything about it, but if you read The Creature from Jekyll Island, they say there's a lot of weird stuff and we don't know where the red came from and who knows and what's going on there. And so this flat Earth thing actually comes from a time where they didn't want anyone to know that the Earth was round because they had the trade imbalance and all that. But there is an idea that that stuff goes that far back. So the fault tolerance aspect, now skipping ahead to this Byzantine general's problem again, the fault tolerance of everything that goes around that requires everyone to keep up their part. On the other end, a Bitcoin attack on the system can be uncoordinated. It requires only a few people here and there in order to make it work, if they're persuasive enough, especially when you think about conditions like this, right? And this comes from Bitcoin Norway, and it's our last thought of the day. Imagine working a 9 to 5 every day for 40 years. Then a guy named Jerome Powell prints 40% of the US dollar supply in 2 years. And in the end, that itself is enough to break down the type of coordination that is required. That itself opens the doors to Jubilee and the Ides of March and a complete reordering and a complete breakup, and hopefully hyper-Bitcoinization, which we love because it's so much better than hyperinflation.